I locked the bathroom door from the outside and for a ridiculous second felt like I was in one of those mystery novels I used to hand out in my literature class. Except the plot twist was steaming, the suspects were wrapped in towels, and the evidence was balled up in a wet manila folder on the sink. I put my hand against the knob and heard a frantic splash. For a woman who had spent 38 years training teenagers to write a decent thesis, I had never felt more like I was grading an exam I hadn't taught. They were both there when I pulled the door open. Jason, my son-in-law, married to my Madison for 18 months, sat ankle-deep in the tub, his hair slicked as if he'd been planning it that way, as if wetness could translate to sincerity. Veronica, Madison's colleague, the one who brought cookies to staff meetings and had opinions about tax-advantaged accounts, was perched on the edge of the tub with one leg tucked beneath her like a woman who'd practiced the pose in corporate mirrors. Neither of them moved, as if the obviousness of being discovered were a new thing. They stared at me with a kind of calculated surprise that comes from people who think life is a careful photo album of choices they can crop. There are two ways you can react in that moment. One is cinematic. You burn bridges, you throw the hairdryer. The other is practical. You do what your job prepared you for. Observe, note, categorize. 38 years of teaching had taught me that teenagers who tried to charm you with a story often left the details out, and the details are where truth lives. So I did the boring, sensible thing. I looked for receipts. There was a manila folder on the counter, half beneath a damp towel, like a creature trying to hide. My thumb brushed the corner, and a glossy photograph slipped free. Blue water, coral roofs, a listing for a villa in the Bahamas with a name stamped across the top in corporate block letters, Mitchell Holdings, LLC. I think you learn things about yourself in crisis. I learned that I could steady my hand and read a ledger like a poem. The numbers were small enough to fit in a single line, but large enough to rearrange a life. Several transfers, each between $25,000 and $75,000, dated on Fridays when Madison's pay cycle ran out. The total, if you added them without tripping over disbelief, came to more than a comfortable retirement account ought to show. My chest did that odd teacher's tick, tighten the way you do when a student hands in a paper full of clever language and no idea. Explain yourself, I said, because why not start with the obvious? Because people who plot will often assume they'll have time to rewrite the script. Jason tried the old charm route first, a smile that had worked on Madison during their courtship. It looked tired on him. Liz, he said, as if the fact that he used an old nickname would cancel out the wet proof around his knees. Veronica's smile was sharper. She looked like she had always been practiced in the business of being liked. "You're welcome here," I said to both of them, because hospitality is as much about tone as it is about bread. But you're not welcome at our expense. They hadn't bothered to hide the folder, which tells you either arrogance or stupidity, both useful qualities to anyone trying to untangle a scheme. Madison had started at Pinnacle Financial 2 years earlier. She was the sort of person who ate her lunch at her desk because she loved spreadsheets the way other people loved romance novels. In our house, she was always the one who read the fine print aloud for the rest of us. When she married Jason, I told myself it was only the addition of a smarter, softer presence to her life, someone to fold her sweaters and argue about political podcasts. I had liked him at their wedding, the way you like someone who smiles at your daughter like she is the sun. I had no idea the smile was a ledger entry. I backed away from the tub like a teacher circling a desk, thinking of the class I used to have called Thinking with Evidence. My brain began to file things in that old way: motive, means, opportunity. Jason had charm, I'd seen it. Veronica had access at Pinnacle. Someone had to have access to client information to make transfers that looked legitimate. Someone had set up Mitchell's Holdings. The Bahamas listing was either a trophy or a transaction. "Don't pretend you can talk your way out of this," I said. My voice surprised me because it didn't quaver. I realized with the small, private relief of someone who has been underestimated too often that I was cooler now than I'd been at my daughter's wedding. Sweetness can be a weapon when wielded by someone who remembers her own worth. I asked for Madison. Neither of them had an answer. Of course they didn't. I called her at work and listened as the elevator music on the other end of the line promised pleasant wait times. When she picked up, I said simply, "Madison, can you handle something at home?" There was a crackle of concern on her end that no amount of corporate posture could hide. She told me she would leave immediately. That was the first domino falling. I eased out of the bathroom with my evidence, photos slipped into my phone, the manila folder tucked under my arm like a report card I'd be forced to read aloud. I went to the kitchen and sat on the stoop of the stairs, because memory is a staircase and I needed a steady foothold. The kettle clicked on, an old habit. The world does not stop being domestic when it becomes criminal. I made myself tea because ritual is often how people buy time to think clearly. This is where I tell you, plainly and without theatrics, I have always been better at noticing patterns than at trusting pleasant narratives. I was a teacher. That's part of the trade. I also like to think that being a mother made me efficient at recognizing when a child's life veered into danger. My mother taught me that being underestimated is an advantage. You get to move while people plan their applause. If you've ever had that quiet little knot of worry that something just wasn't right, leave a one-line comment. Tell me if you ever ignored it or if you listened. I'll wait for the chorus later, but for now, keep reading. Madison arrived before the police could, and she was all sharp edges and questions. She saw the folder, then the phone with the pictures, and I watched her mouth soften into a mixture of rage and arithmetic. She opened the file like someone reading their own test results and sketched numbers into the margin. Dates of transfers, her last 3 paydays, the balance of her retirement. I've never seen my daughter look so adult. She stopped being my girl in that moment and became someone else, someone who could turn grief into a plan. "We need to call the police," she said. It was reasonable and procedural, the way Madison always was. The house felt smaller after that sentence, like every room was suddenly part of an exhibit in a museum of betrayals. I called 911. I said the words in the flat way teachers learn to use when reading out a roll call. Then I did the thing you do when you are a parent and you fear a spectacle. I grabbed a sweater and walked out the front door to wait on the porch, because confrontation needs a witness and because it's good to be outside when tempers are reconfigured. David Hayes, the man married to Veronica, arrived before the uniforms as if the universe had decided to let the blindsided husband play some minor role in justice. He stood on the sidewalk looking like someone who'd been told his favorite piece of furniture had been sold out from under him. He had a face full of the bewildered hurt you see in neighborhood sagas. Disbelief, then a brief fury, then the desiccated acceptance of someone who had to plan the next steps. "I trusted her," he said later, when I spoke to him while Detective Harrison took statements. "It wasn't a question. Trust, in these stories, is the currency pilfered more often than cash." The officers who showed up were competent and unflustered in a way that comforted me. Detective Harrison introduced himself with the kind of plain professionalism that suggests someone has been to too many kitchens and has developed an appetite for straightforward facts. He kept his questions crisp and his voice lower than the news anchors. I liked him immediately. "You're the homeowner?" he asked, which in police parlance means, are you the one who claims the loss and will likely be the first to testify? "Yes," I said. The drama of it felt daily and mercantile. My living room had become a scene, and I was its curator. He asked what I had seen. I told him, careful to stick to observations, no embellishment. He took notes like a man transcribing a ledger. At his side was a woman in a blazer who introduced herself as Patricia Morgan from Pinnacle Financial's Internal Security. Patricia had the measured look of someone who had made a career of separating personal feeling from institutional damage. Her presence changed the tone from a domestic fracas to something that smelled faintly of corporate corridors, tidy, papered, and ultimately expensive. Patricia did not look surprised at the folder. She took photographs of the documents with a professional hand and said, "We'll need to review Madison's account history," as if to remind the room that there are larger machines in motion than feet on hardwood floors. Detective Harrison asked if Madison had noticed anything unusual at work, new colleagues, requests for client access, anything at all. My daughter mentioned a reorganization, an efficiency push, a new client engagement specialist who had done a lot of the legwork on certain accounts. Veronica's name had been mentioned only in a passing, friendly way until now. Patricia's face was a mask of polite concern until she heard a company name whispered, Mitchell Holdings. It was as if someone had turned up a light in a storage closet and the dust had become visible. We sat. There is a peculiar kind of silence that arrives after alarms. It is not peaceful. It is the silence of people who are updating their internal maps to include new hazards. I took a breath and did what my teaching instincts still dragged me toward, organize facts into a sequence. The transfers had been timed. The amounts were engineered not to alarm the small oversight teams. Mitchell Holdings had the shell of a corporation and the glossy photo of a property overseas. It read like a scheme built with the sturdiness of a student's cheating plan, careful, confident, assuming you'll never meet the author. David asked the question out loud that had been burning in all our heads. How could they do that? That was not only an emotional plea, it was a procedural one. The answer, Detective Harrison began, was rarely a single person. These things need two kinds of people, he said. There's the one who wants money and the one who can move it without catching dust. Sometimes one person can do both, but usually, especially at this scale, there's collusion. I thought of Richard Carlson then, the senior partner at Pinnacle, the one who smiled with what looked like goodwill, but often felt like a handshake with a bank ledger hidden in his sleeve. I had met him at charity dinners where he gave speeches about fiduciary duty and mentorship. People like him are good at the theater of virtue. Madison sat very still. Her fingers tightened around the file like a woman holding a rosary. He wouldn't do this, she said, the denial of a child who still wants to cover a bruise and go to soccer practice. He might, Patricia said, curt and businesslike, or he might have been kept out of the loop by someone with operational access. These schemes don't always need the partner at the top to sign off, but when you see a pattern of altered client instructions and diverted transfers, you look up and sideways. "It's bigger than an affair, isn't it?" David asked. "Yes," Detective Harrison said, "at least potentially. We need Madison's account statements, records of any third-party authorizations, and access to any correspondence between her and her team at Pinnacle." Madison handed over what she had without hesitation. That in itself was a small act of bravery. She opened her laptop right there on our kitchen table, the screen a portal into a life suddenly rearranged. I had always admired the way she had the patience to pore over detail. It seemed now to be saving her. There were emails, short, oddly efficient notes that read like transcripts. "Please approve the transfer to Mitchell Holdings for vendor payment. Confirm once wire goes through. Remit to account ending in 3241. The sort of benign language that looks like housekeeping when seen in isolation, but they were paired with bank records. ACH transfers out of accounts labeled trust and client disbursements to a business name that wasn't local and to banks with routing numbers in an offshore gateway. "You can't just wire a client's account without authorization," Patricia said. So either there was authorization, forged signatures, or internal manipulation. Forged signatures are theatrical. Internal manipulation is quieter, and the quiet is usually the most dangerous. Someone with database access who could change who is authorized to approve payments is a someone who will leave minimal fingerprints but be instrumental to theft. Detective Harrison asked me about the manila folder again. Where did you find it? In the bathroom, I said, on the counter, towel half over it, like someone wanted it out of sight but not too far. It looked like someone who was confident they'd have time to put things away again. He nodded. Sometimes arrogance leads to sloppy execution. While the officers took statements, I wandered back to the hallway and found Jason sitting on the front step like a man who'd decided to wait for a judgment he hadn't considered. He tried once more to be disarming. "Elizabeth," he said, using my name like it was a charm. "It wasn't what it looks like." "You picked the tub," I told him. "If you thought it was nothing, you could have at least chosen a place with less evidence." He laughed, small and brittle. "You've got to believe me. I can explain." "Explain what, Jason?" Madison said, sharper than I'd heard her. "Explain why over the last 12 months, my retirement account lost $87,500 and nothing at work told me. Explain why your company name keeps showing up on wire confirmations." There is a particular animal quality to the moment when someone you love starts to move from disbelief to comprehension. It is the slow, terrible focusing of a lens, and there is no turning it away. Jason's posture changed the way someone's face changes when they've been called to the board and know they have to give an account, not to the board for once, but to the family. "I have clients," he said. "I do consulting." The language was a veil. Sometimes money moves. It happens. Detective Harrison stepped in like a teacher on the playground. "Jason, we're going to ask you to remain here until we sort this out. We'll need your identification, and we'll be conducting an initial interview." "How long?" he asked, the words small and startled. "Long enough for the truth to catch up," Detective Harrison said, and the phrase was not exactly poetic, but it had the weight of someone who had seen confessions come in layers. I watched as the scene tightened into procedure. Officers took Jason's ID, someone from digital forensics asked for his phone. There is a delicate choreography to that, one you do not appreciate until you are in it. Patricia called her legal team and started the slow, methodical process of institutional containment, freeze transfers, notify compliance, secure systems. They took Veronica aside, with David watching like someone who had been handed a foreign manual to read. I felt the old urge to protect my daughter, but I also felt a fierce, clean thing that wanted the world to be correct. Justice, to me, is less about spectacle and more about accuracy. It was time to find out how many pages the book of this fraud would be. Before anyone could lock down the house fully, something arrived in the forecourt of my mind, an email archive. I'd seen a flash of subject lines on Jason's laptop earlier that had sounded oddly administrative: client reallocation approvals, Mitchell Holdings wire log, and the rest. Those subject lines had the same smell as the Bahamas glossy photo, a made thing pretending to be real. Detective Harrison asked if I was willing to share what I had photographed on my phone. He was polite about it. He was also precise in a way that told me he knew evidence and chain of custody make the difference between a conviction and a file that sits on a shelf. I handed the phone to him with the same feeling you have when you pass a test paper to a principal. There is relief in handing over the truth. "You were very careful," he said, scrolling. He appreciated craft. I appreciated competence. Patricia had already started cross-referencing the dates in the folder with internal logs. "We have a handful of clients who reported irregular disbursements," she said quietly. "Not many, but enough to warrant a formal audit." The word audit in corporate mouths has many teeth. "And what about Richard Carlson?" I asked, because if you're going to be honest about the world, sometimes you must call the names you suspect. Patricia didn't flicker. She has a manner of someone who keeps the institution's patience alongside personal responsibility. "We'll be conducting interviews up the chain," she said. "We don't jump to conclusions." I thought of those charity dinners and his speech about fiduciary duty, about mentorship. Men in suits are practiced at carrying the language of trust like a badge. They hide things well inside speeches. It happens often enough that you start to look for the seams. Detective Harrison leaned toward Madison and said softly, "We'll open an investigation. We'll need you to meet with our financial crimes unit. We'll also coordinate with federal partners if we start seeing an offshore trail that suggests wire fraud beyond state lines." There is a particular brick weight to those words, federal partners, that makes a domestic betrayal suddenly become a matter of interstate law and jurisdiction. It lends a coldness that helps, in its way. It makes the personal wrong into an infraction that can be prosecuted within a system that is not about feelings. Madison looked up at him, and in that glance I saw the small, bright flame of someone who would not let this define her. "Do whatever it takes," she said. "I don't want just an apology. I want the money back. I want them held accountable." The honesty of that sentence was both ideological and practical. She did not speak with a sense of entitlement. She spoke with the resolve of someone who knows what's fair. I felt my chest, old teacher reflex, swell with pride. That fierce maternal pride is a soft weapon. It steadies you and makes others measure their steps against you. They escorted Jason and Veronica to separate rooms for initial interviews. Someone advised David to get a lawyer. Someone else suggested that he sit with a counselor. The number of people involved was growing like a vine. Neighbors calling, friends texting, a local reporter who had somehow gotten a tip and was somewhere sharpening his pen. This can be the rub of public incidents. Someone will always want to make art from your pain. Before long, a quiet sedan pulled up, and a man in a plain suit introduced himself as Special Agent Rodriguez with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. He moved differently than the local police, less of the bench and slate practicalness, and more the kind of calm that suggests this is something he'd hoped to avoid, but had spent his career preparing for. His presence meant the case had the taste of jurisdictional teeth. "You'll need to be patient," Agent Rodriguez told us, introducing himself in the kind of neutral tone that doesn't promise much beyond procedure. "We coordinate with local law enforcement when there is probable interstate wire fraud or suspicious offshore transfers. From what I've been briefed, your case has markers that could fit that bill." Markers are the FBI's way of saying, there is smoke and we need to find the fire. It is clinical. It is efficacious. Patricia handed him copies of the documents and highlighted the accounts and transfer dates. Agent Rodriguez's face didn't betray much, but his fingers moved as if already arranging chess pieces. He asked about access, who had administrative rights to client accounts, who could authorize transfers, and whether there had been any recent changes in personnel. He was hunting for the fulcrums. "This looks like more than a domestic theft," he said slowly. "We'll need to look at server logs, email headers, authorization notes, anything that shows who fingerprinted the approvals." Detective Harrison asked the obvious, could we trust inside audit logs at Pinnacle? Patricia assured him they could, that the company had internal controls and logs, though she admitted those could be circumvented. That admission made my skin prickle. It is always the evasive bit. Someone believes they won't be looked at again that trips them into clumsiness. As Agent Rodriguez turned to leave, he paused and looked at me. Not at my daughter, not at the papers, but at me. "Miss Walker, your initiative in preserving that folder and taking photos could be very valuable. We'll need statements and copies, and there may be a formal interview. We'll also discuss whether any civilian-assisted actions are necessary, but only if coordinated and lawful." I appreciated the caution. He didn't use the word bait. He used civilian-assisted actions, a bureaucratic code for something that could look messier on the street. The FBI does not improvise with civilians, nor should anyone expect them to. They recognize the temptation of vigilante justice and temper it with policy. Madison leaned forward. "I would do anything if it helps," she said. And in those words was the rawness of a person who has learned that agency is often the only cure for being violated. Agent Rodriguez nodded. "We'll be in touch. For now, we'll secure the evidence, interview all relevant parties, and if we get probable cause for federal charges, we'll move to seize assets and follow the trail." The phrasing was careful, and that was reassuring. Addiction to closure can make one reckless. We needed methodical steps. Arrests based on shaky evidence collapse on the stand. Convictions built on thorough work last. That afternoon, after the house had quieted and the officers had left with copies of everything, Patricia stayed behind with Madison to ensure client notifications and to freeze any suspicious outbound wires. Detective Harrison left with a promise to call as soon as they had the initial interview reports. Agent Rodriguez told me he would have someone call to schedule a formal statement. I sat at my own kitchen table and looked at the manila folder now spread between two mugs, a strange sort of breakfast tableau. The markers and spreadsheets had the same rhythm, a ledger of small betrayals. I poured more tea. It is odd how domestic rituals are the scaffolding of our nervous systems. You clean, brew, sit, and the world resumes some of its predictability. There was a moment, quiet and sharp, when David and I exchanged a look. No drama, no sharp words. Instead, we were two people who had been forced instantly to learn new rules of engagement in our lives. He said, quietly, she loved Veronica. The confession was both accusation and sorrow. People love who they let into their lives, I said. Sometimes we don't recognize the doorways we leave open. We talked about restitution. They both wanted the money returned, evidence pursued, and, more than that, narrative repair. How do you tell a story where your child is both clever and gullible? How do you explain that someone you trusted could be both intimate in the bath and instrumental in turning a life upside down? The questions have no tidy answers. Later that evening, long after the house had been listed in official notes and files, Madison and I sat on the back steps while the sun dropped like a coin behind the trees. Our neighborhood sounded ordinary, someone mowing a lawn, a dog barking. The mundanity was a balm. "You know what I want?" Mad said, surprising me by being unsentimental. "I want this to be useful. I want to make sure no one else at Pinnacle or anywhere can be convinced by smooth words and fake corporate names." She meant advocacy, prevention, making trauma productive. I had always suspected that was in her. She was exceptionally good at turning a table of numbers into a human story. This was, perhaps, her chance to turn a wound into warning. It is one of the terrible consolations of these moments. Pain can become purpose. We made a list, because lists were how we both handled chaos. First, cooperate with investigators. Second, do not speak to the press without counsel. Third, preserve documents and any digital correspondence. Fourth, be careful of social media. The list was a shallow thing, but it was something to anchor to. I went to bed that night with the strange, humming feeling of a lesson not yet complete. A domestic revelation had become an investigation, and I knew, with the old certainty teachers have about tests, that the second half of this course would be harder. There would be interviews, subpoenas, countersuits, bureaucracy as a battleground. But I also felt a small, fierce sense that being underestimated had handed me a kind of leverage. The world believed I was simply a retired teacher. What they had not accounted for was how much a career of observing people prepares you to notice the hinge points of deception. Still, there was a gap in the information that hummed at the edges. Who at Pinnacle had the power to authorize transfers? Who had set up Mitchell Holdings? How many accounts had been touched? The answers would determine whether this was a two-person scheme or something that reached higher and wider than our kitchen. The next morning, while the house was quiet and the folder lay in a neat pile on the dining table, as if waiting for its turn in a library, my phone rang. Patricia Morgan was on the line. "We found something," she said without preamble. Anomalous access to server logs last year tied to an administrative account. We need to pull more logs, and you'll need to come in to identify a few things for us. You said something to Harrison about Richard Carlson, Madison said over my shoulder, not accusatory, but hungry for the shape of the truth. Patricia's voice over speaker was crisp. We have irregular access that appears to have been routed through a set of credentials that were likely temporary. We are still preliminary, but we have reason to believe someone had the ability to manipulate authorizations. We'll coordinate with the Bureau. That word again, preliminary, neither a promise nor a denial, but in the way of all slow revealing things, it felt like a door opening. I listened to the hum of the kettle coming to a boil as Patricia outlined next steps. Preserve all devices, arrange interviews, legally coordinate any civilian steps. No stunts, she added, in a tone that made me smile because she had said what Agent Rodriguez had also said earlier, but with a corporate crispness that carried an implied, and I mean it. The word stunts is precise. It concedes our narrative hunger for dramatic self-heroism while gently reminding us that justice does not need spectacle, it needs evidence. Patricia suggested Madison come by the office the next day to go through client communications and flagged transactions with their internal compliance team under supervision. Agent Rodriguez would likely want to debrief afterward. I felt a thrill of practical things, buttons to be pushed in correct order. It was the kind of work that suited my daughter. As she hung up the call, Madison looked at me with a determination that soft people sometimes misread as brittle. We will do this right, she said. We'll make sure the record is clean. I wouldn't expect anything less, I said. For the first time since the bathroom door swung open, I let myself think about the end of the story, though I didn't yet know its form. There would be interviews, maybe arrests, perhaps prosecutions. There would be heartbreak and restitution, or there would be the slow, stubborn truth that sometimes systems fail and the work to fix them takes years. I put the kettle on again for the third time that morning and made more tea. I find that making tea steadies me in a way nothing else does. I am not a woman of grand gestures. I am a woman who arranges facts the way other people arrange flowers. My bold plan, if you want to call it that, and the headline will, so we might as well admit it, is not cinematic. It is practical. It is paperwork. It is patience. Patricia called back later that morning. We're escalating, she said. There is an account series linked to Mitchell Holdings that shows disbursements routed through a bank in the Bahamas and then to a holding account that is potentially accessible in the States. We are going to coordinate with the Bureau. I felt, in that moment, the vertigo of a thing becoming larger than our kitchen. It is a strange comfort and a stranger threat when personal betrayal steps into federal jurisdiction. It means someone else will carry the weight of the legal choreography. It also means the story will be slower. Subpoenas, warrants, subpoenas again. Justice is patient, which is both small consolation and a truth. Later that afternoon, I sat with Madison and David while Detective Harrison walked us through what would come next. There would be interviews. We would be asked to preserve everything. We would all have to be careful in how we discussed things in public. He looked at me at one point and said, kindly, "You did the right thing by calling us when you did. If you had waited, evidence could have been altered." "You're welcome," I said, reflexively bolder than the occasion warranted. When they left, Madison and I stood in the quiet and felt like two people at the foot of a ladder. We could see a top platform somewhere out of sight, but the rungs between were not yet placed. I thought of my students, many years ago, who would race to the finish line and stumble because they had not learned to pace themselves. So I told my daughter what I always tell them: measure your work, record your sources, and be patient. "Mom," she said, with a soft laugh that carried both weary humor and gratitude, "thanks for locking the door." "You forgot the part where I made you lessons out of betrayal," I said. "Consider this another chapter in your continuing education." We both laughed then, small and necessary. A laugh is a kind of punctuation in grief. It does not erase the sentence, but it gives you a beat before continuing. That night, as I cleared the dishes, I thought about the bathtub and the towel and the way someone had thought to hide a manila folder under a towel but had left the corner exposed. I thought about the vulnerability of systems that trusted people more than paperwork. I thought, with a low, fierce satisfaction, that being a woman who had spent a lifetime noticing small things had put me in a place to see a big thing. There would be interviews and subpoenas. There would be someone like Agent Rodriguez knitting together a chain of custody. There would be complicated legal language and cautious steps. My role, if the investigators chose to take me up, would be to be patient, to present facts, and to be, if they needed it, a steady witness. But there was another thought, one I carried like a ribbon. Being underestimated is an asset. At 62, I had the advantage of invisibility. People like to assume the elderly are fading into the background. We are not. We are repositories of memory, of patterns, of small, dangerous knowledges. There would be interviews and subpoenas. There would be someone like Agent Rodriguez knitting together a chain of custody. There would be complicated legal language and cautious steps. My role, if the investigators chose to take me up, would be to be patient, to present facts, and to be, if they needed it, a steady witness. But there was another thought, one I carried like a ribbon. Being underestimated is an asset. At 62, I had the advantage of invisibility. People like to assume the elderly are fading into the background. We are not. We are repositories of memory, of patterns, of small, dangerous knowledges. As the house settled and the night deepened, I sat at my kitchen table and began to make another list, this time of practical things. Copies to give to the detectives, passwords to change, people to notify at work, a support group to call. I made the list long and pragmatic because lists turned chaos into homework. I slept badly that night, not from fear exactly, but from the kind of restlessness that comes when your life has been rearranged and you are impatient for the neatness of a final draft. In the morning, the legal choreography picked up where human emotion had left off. Patricia called first thing and asked me to come by Pinnacle for a secure room interview. Agent Rodriguez wanted to walk through the records himself. Detective Harrison needed copies of my photos for his file. I stepped into that small cyclone with the steady habit of someone who has always been good at doing the next right thing. I was not a hero. I was a tool in a well-made machine, and in this case, I liked the idea of being useful. At Pinnacle, the internal conference room felt like an operating theater. There were bright lights, calibrated chairs, and a long table with the sort of clarity that makes people physically smaller. Patricia was already there, clipboard in hand, exuding the coolness of a person who had trained herself to keep feeling private and procedure public. Agent Rodriguez arrived with 2 agents who carried themselves like men who had watched too many human dramas to be surprised. Detective Harrison came in with his steady, literal presence. We sat and went through the timeline. The forensics team had been thorough overnight. They found login timestamps that matched the transfers and traced a pattern of temporary admin credentials that had been rotated through a cluster of machines assigned to a small team. The names on access logs included Veronica's workstation and an admin alias that, when cross-referenced with other files, pointed to an account provisioned by someone on Richard Carlson's team. There were logs, metadata, and the kind of benign corporate language that, when strung together, sounded like intent. That admin account would have the ability to adjust authorization hierarchies, Agent Rodriguez explained. If someone with that credential wanted to add a third-party payee and authorize it in the system, they could. It leaves an electronic trail, but you need to follow it carefully. Patricia had flagged a dozen clients who had small but consistent irregularities. None of the transfers would have triggered large alarms individually, deliberately sized to fall below thresholds, but together they painted a pattern. Someone had designed the theft to look like housekeeping. That, to me, was the cruelest part. You could imagine coffee and quiet clicks, and while someone was supposed to be balancing ledgers, others were balancing lives. We began to see the architecture of complicity. Veronica with her inside access. Jason, who provided an apparent consulting front, Mitchell Holdings, that could receive funds, and a set of credentials that allowed the movement. The question that remained was whether Richard Carlson, the person at the helm of the firm who wielded influence and patronage, had knowledge, or whether this was a case of a system manipulated under his nose. The way institutions protect their reputations can sometimes shield abusers and reward their skill in stagecraft. "Do you want me interviewed?" I asked at one point, because the impulse to be everywhere at once is a teacher's curse. Agent Rodriguez looked at me as if I were both a witness and a resource he hoped to use judiciously. "Yes," he said, "but we'll coordinate. We need your statement, and we may ask you to participate in controlled actions later. Anything you do in the field will be with our oversight." That line, "with our oversight," was the tether that kept me honest. It meant law. It meant procedure. It meant if I was going to be used as bait, there would be a net. I agreed without hesitation. I had not come to this for drama. I had come for truth. The next days became a rhythm of document retrieval, interviews, and patient waiting. Pinnacle's compliance team worked to freeze suspicious accounts and notify affected clients. David spoke with his lawyer and began the slow business of disentangling his own finances. He was as cooperative as anyone might hope for someone whose marriage had been shredded. Jason and Veronica were held for questioning. Their initial statements were, unsurprisingly, slippery. There is a kind of language people use when they are trying to make themselves small and plausible. I handled vendor relationships. I was asked to manage a pilot. There must be a mistake. Unfortunately for them, accounting is not good at accepting rhetorical modesty. One small victory came when we found an invoice template used to authorize transfers that contained a typographical quirk, an extra space between words that matched other documents on a shared folder accessible to Veronica. It's the little things that give a conspiracy away: a repeated typo, a duplicate header, a user who forgets to log out. My teaching instincts loved those mistakes. They were the equivalent of red pen on a draft. We began to build a chain of evidence. Emails, server logs, incriminating templates, and the manila folder. Each piece moved from my home to a secure evidence vault. We made sure the chain of custody was intact because Agent Rodriguez and Patricia both warned me that prosecutors will throw the book of technicalities at anything that looks inattentive. Conviction isn't sentimental, it's methodical. Weeks passed in a blur of depositions and subpoenas. News leaked because these things leak, and a local reporter did write a piece that painted the affair in lurid brushstrokes. We kept our heads down. The FBI's involvement meant federal investigators were careful about what they confirmed publicly. There was a professionalism in confidentiality that made the ordeal less performative and more precise. At one point, the investigation deepened into financial records tied to an old client of Richard Carlson who had recently passed away. There were transfers out of a trust account that looked like normal estate maintenance until you noticed they were routed through account numbers and institutions that suddenly made offshore transfers plausible. The picture got larger and, with it, more dangerous politically for the firm. When you threaten a senior partner in a place where politics of reputation and philanthropy are currency, you often invite defensive maneuvers. Richard, for his part, maintained a calm public face. He made a statement about cooperation and fiduciary responsibility that read like a script. He attended charity events, shook hands, and offered empty reassurances that sounded to my ear like the kinds of platitudes men offer when they don't want follow-up questions. He was practiced. He had a team of lawyers and a PR person who could make denial look like humility. Agent Rodriguez told us bluntly, "Big targets will have lawyers who move quickly. They will attempt to limit exposure. We need to be airtight." He was not melodramatic about it. He was precise. The federal machine is not interested in stories. It is interested in evidence. That suited me. I prefer measurable things. The first arrests were quiet. Jason and Veronica were taken into custody on state charges related to the unauthorized transfers. They were processed, booked, and read their rights. The initial plea negotiations began. In court, you always get a sense of the real cost of human error. Jason's face had the pale hollowness of someone who has discovered that charm is a currency that can be bankrupt. Veronica, by contrast, seemed to oscillate between composure and the occasional flicker of fear. I learned in those days that shame shows itself differently on different faces. The more significant problem was whether we had enough to pierce the corporate shield and implicate someone higher up. Agent Rodriguez and his team followed the login patterns, traced IP hops, and subpoenaed server backups. They found evidence of administrative approvals that bore Richard's digital signature. That discovery shifted the investigation from a pair of opportunists to potential systemic collusion, or at least to a situation where someone with power had either enabled or failed to notice a pattern of irregularity that should have raised alarms. Whether that rose to criminal intent would be for a grand jury to decide. It was during that slow scouring that Patricia found the email we had all feared and hoped to find. A brief exchange between an assistant in Carlson's office and a junior compliance officer discussing an exception that had been processed for Mitchell Holdings with the notation, "handled per Richard." There are times when a single line of text is the hinge of a case. This was one of them. "You understand what this implies?" Patricia asked me in a low voice when she sent me the redacted copy. I understood all too well. It implied either that Richard knew or that someone in his immediate orbit was comfortable enough with his tacit approval to mark documents that way. Either way, it was a needle that needed to be followed. By now, the FBI had assembled enough to convene a grand jury. Testimonies were scheduled. I gave a formal statement, walked through the manila folder, and explained my discovery in exact tones. They asked me the same questions twice, with the clinical patience of people making a record for a jury. I did not mind. The work felt necessary. The grand jury lasted as long as these things do. Weeks of closed-door testimony, evidence presented by attorneys who know the art of persuasion in rooms without cameras. When indictments returned, they came down like long internal thunder. Jason and Veronica were charged on state counts, and the federal indictment named a small cluster of individuals, including an indictment that included conspiracy to commit wire fraud and aiding and abetting unauthorized transfers. Richard Carlson was among those indicted. The name made headlines in the way that names do, a sudden pivot from philanthropy to prosecution. I sat in a courtroom for much of the initial proceedings, a spectator to a process designed to be deliberate. There were motions and motions to suppress, and hearings about the admissibility of the email Patricia had found. His defense was vigorous. Mistakes happen, bureaucracies make errors, names get misattached. There were arguments about whether the notation "handled per Richard" was a directive or an administrative shorthand. Lawyers are, by trade, specialists in arguing for the saving grace of ambiguity. Agent Rodriguez and Detective Harrison watched all of this with the professional restraint of people who know not to let public outrage dictate courtroom strategy. They wanted the case to be implacable. I admired them for it. Preparation, I had learned, can be a kind of moral courage. It does not feel glamorous, it feels obstinately procedural. As the legal tilt continued, the prosecution crafted a plan to remove Richard from the public scene. He remained free on bail during pretrial, but the indictment meant severe reputational hits. He stepped back from public roles, resigned from a couple of boards, and his speeches dried up. It is fascinating to watch how quickly the scaffolding of a public life is dismantled when the foundation is called into question. It felt performative in a way that reminded me of my days at the theater, of a classroom, coaxing teenagers into becoming characters to understand literature. Acting, it turns out, is useful in many parts of life. The day of the meeting, I chose my outfit deliberately, a cardigan that read widowed neighbor and a scarf that suggested small dignity. The cafe smelled of browned coffee and milk foam. I had my purse, a stack of doctored documents that an attorney had authorized for the exercise, letters that suggested a woman with resources but in need of discretion. The wire was small, the earpiece slick and cool behind my ear. Agent Rodriguez whispered through my mic. When he says X, say Y. If he asks about transfers, steer him toward conversations about keeping quiet and protecting reputations. Do not improvise admissions. We want him to speak. The man I was there to meet was not a monstrous cartoon. He was a polished man in a tailored coat, the kind who spoke quietly and assumed people would listen. He asked me about my daughter, about how much I wanted to avoid public scandal. He promised discretion. He promised a network that could, hypothetically, take care of things quietly. His voice was the voice of people who had often been able to buy silence. And when he mentioned a name, Richard, and said a phrase that implied an ability to route things through the right channels, the agent's hands tightened on the promise of what could come. At that moment, when the man braced to reassure me about making small arrangements, a team who had been sitting in the next room moved. Agents stood, laptops open, signals exchanged. The man's smile faltered in that tiny second between bluff and exposure. The difference between a confident liar and a man in cuffs is often a matter of timing. They moved quickly. Agents from the FBI emerged, identified themselves, and read the suspect his rights. The man, surprised, did not immediately resist. I watched him process the transition from actor to defendant like someone whose life had been a long rehearsal for a moment that finally arrived. The arrest was not cinematic, no shouting, no dramatic chase, just the crisp business of a felony suspect being led from a cafe table. Afterwards, Agent Rodriguez embraced me in a way that did not feel like a cliché. "You did good," he said. The relief I felt was primitive and enormous, like the easing of a hand off a hot kettle. The sting had worked, and it had done so because we preserved procedure and used truth as a lure. The man arrested at the cafe turned out to be a mid-level handler who had been in the habit of smoothing transactions through a set of consulting entities. His statements, once in the tidy custody of recorded interviews, connected threads. Under questioning and the steady pressure of evidence, he began to name names. He spoke of accounts, of emails marked "handled per Richard," and of an institutional culture that rewarded plausible deniability. It is startling how quickly a small chain can be pulled and reveal a longer rope. With the cafe arrest and the mid-level handler's cooperation, prosecutors were able to move with a firmer hand. They consolidated the evidence gathered from our manila folder, the server logs, the bank transfers, and the recorded conversations into an indictment that looked less like conjecture and more like an accusation built on records. The presentation to a federal grand jury included forensic accountants showing money flow charts, agents testifying about metadata, and lawyers explaining the legal theories that turned financial artifacts into criminal intent. The trial was not quick. Trials seldom are. There are pretrial motions, plea offers, and strategic pauses. Jason and Veronica were offered plea deals in exchange for testimony. They took them to varying degrees, admitting to their roles in the scheme and providing details that filled gaps. Their cooperation shortened the timeline to the big trial, but it did not make it easy. Testifying in open court scraped away the polish on their excuses and left the rawness of their actions visible. Richard's trial drew an audience the way powerful do. He sat with his lawyers, and the air about him had the brittle quality of someone used to being trusted. Prosecutors methodically laid out a pattern: small transfers timed to fall below detection, a shell company receiving funds, people paid to be quiet,
and an administrative pattern that suggested a culture of permissive oversight. They did not show him as a monstrous caricature. They showed him as a man who had built influence and, in doing so, had perhaps cultivated a climate where confessions were an inconvenience and profitability a priority. In court, Agent Rodriguez and Patricia testified, and I sat in the gallery and watched the proceedings with a kind of detached awe. Madison sat beside me sometimes, and other times she worked with the prosecution team. She used her expertise to explain the mechanics of certain transactions in terms prosecutors could use. Watching her in that role, composed, articulate, transforming the language of loss into the language of accountability, was the kind of parental pride that produces a physical warmth behind the ribs. The defense tried to separate their client from the acts, arguing ambiguous authority and accidental oversight. They presented character witnesses, philanthropic deeds, and lengthy CVs. The prosecution countered with digital trails, email notations, and the mid-level handler's testimony. It felt to me like watching two different literatures, one of good deeds and another of cold record, compete for the jury's attention. When the verdict finally came, it was a sober room. The jury returned convictions on several counts. The judge read the sentence with a cadence that belonged to someone who understands the gravity of federal punishment.
Richard was sentenced to several years in federal prison, and the others received sentences that reflected their roles, from the mid-level handler to Jason and Veronica. The court also ordered restitution where possible and authorized asset seizures of properties tied to the shell companies. The legal outcome was not a perfect restoration of what had been lost. Financial theft seldom allows full repair, but it was accountability. There was a strange, complex relief when the gavel finally fell. It was not cathartic so much as corrective. Justice had been done in a way that used the patience of the law rather than the heat of revenge. I felt vindicated, yes, but mostly I felt a steadier heartbeat in the world, an acknowledgement that small, careful work can unseat oversized arrogance. In the months that followed, Madison did what she had said she would. She turned trauma into purpose. She was recruited by a federal task force to consult on client protection and anti-fraud measures. The agents were impressed by her technical understanding and her steadiness under pressure. She accepted a position that began as an advisory role and transitioned into full-time work with the Bureau's Financial Crimes Division. I watched as her grief turned into the language of prevention. It helps, she told me once, halfway through a cup of tea when we were sitting in the very garden where she used to color Easter eggs as a child. It's not that I wanted this to happen, it's that I wanted to make sure it happens to fewer people. She began to lead community workshops on spotting financial scams, speaking to small groups at library meetings and women's clubs, showing people how to read the fine print without becoming paranoid. Her work was practical: how to verify a transfer, the importance of two-factor authentication, the red flags of shell companies. She never gave people a manual for revenge. She gave them the tools to ask good questions and to insist on transparency. We started together a small nonprofit, a series of seminars for people who had been targets of financial exploitation. Madison focused on technical training and worked with the FBI to design curricula for financial literacy. I taught workshops in local senior centers on how to spot unusual requests and how to keep records. The irony that a bathtub and a soggy manila folder had led to a curriculum on caution was not lost on us. From our kitchen table, we began to seed a small but determined prevention movement. Neighbors who had once whispered expressed their admiration more directly. David and I became allies of a sort who spoke in the language of mutual repair. He and Veronica had separated. Some marriages do not recover from the kind of breach that money and intimacy together produce. There was no easy moralizing. It was, in many ways, a pragmatic sorting of lives. Sometimes people ask if I regret having opened that bathroom door. They expect a dramatic answer. regret for the pain inflicted on my family. But the truth is complicated. I regret the harm we had to endure. I do not regret the discovery. The world is hard enough without people making fortunes out of quiet betrayals. If a woman looking at a soaked manila folder can start a chain of events that closes doors on predatory practices, then I will live with the discomfort of the moment. People also ask what it felt like to be underestimated. I tell them I celebrated it privately. At 62, people expect a kind of domestic stillness. They do not expect you to have the muscle memory of interrogation, of patient note-taking, of the kind of stubborn curiosity that makes you notice typographical quirks. I have a bookshelf where I keep the small, annotated works I used in my teaching career. I added a new volume now, a notebook where I had kept timelines, notes, and the names of people who had called to offer help. It is a strange thing to preserve, pages of pain and progress. But I like having it there, a ledger of what we accomplished. Madison's career unfolded into public service. She wasn't interested in fame. She wanted protection for others, for people like her who had been targeted because trust was weaponized against them. In time, she became part of a task force that helped the Bureau design outreach programs for smaller communities vulnerable to white-collar fraud. Her voice, calm, technical, and empathetic, carried weight. People listened. As for me, I returned to domestic things with a new agenda. I taught workshops, gave talks at community centers, and wrote op-eds about the quiet ways that systems can be gamed. I found a strange joy in teaching again. Not teenagers this time, but adults who needed the fundamentals of skepticism, record-keeping, and the courage to ask questions. Teaching, I discovered, is an act of care, and care can be revolutionary when it prevents predation. Sometimes, on evenings when the light turns gold, Madison and I sit on the back steps with tea and a silence that is not empty but comfortable. We talk about the small things, books we've read, neighbors' gardens, but we also talk frankly about the past. She will sometimes trace a figure in the tea steam and say, with a light laugh, "You always knew, didn't you?" "I always had a suspicion," I answer, which is the gentler truth. Suspicion without action is only an emotion. It takes courage to turn it into work. We never framed what we did as revenge. It never felt like that. It felt like correction. It felt like using the tools at hand, observation, persistence, collaboration, to restore balance where someone had sought imbalance. We were the kinds of people who chose process over spectacle, and that choice mattered. In small, daily ways, we repaired. Calls with client liaisons, checks to court-ordered restitution funds where possible, community meetings where people asked blunt questions and learned to interpret legalese into guardrails. People who had been victims found their voice in our workshops. Clients found some measure of restitution. Nothing erased the emotional cost of betrayal, but accountability is a kind of balm. Years later, Madison and I would speak in public forums about our experience. We were careful with language, never eager to encourage vigilantism, always insistent that civilian action must be coordinated with lawful authorities. We recounted how evidence matters, how paperwork can reveal deception, and how organizational cultures can either deter or enable theft. People responded with gratitude and sometimes with stories of their own. When the local high school asked me to speak about civic responsibility and the value of clear writing, I took Madison with me. She talked about financial prudence. I talked about noticing details. The students asked how to protect themselves in a world where charm can be currency. We taught them to read letters, to archive emails, to ask for receipts. Not paranoid acts, but practical ones. Sometimes, late at night, when the neighborhood is silent and the kettle clicks on, I think of that bathtub, the steam, the towels, the corner of a manila folder poking out like a truth that belonged in daylight. I think of being underestimated and how that underestimation can be a kind of invisible armor. I think of the lessons that children carry forward from the adults around them, that love will sometimes make you gullible, that intelligence needs companions and courage, and that justice done patiently is more sustained than justice done loudly. If there is a final thing I would say about the whole business, it is that ordinary vigilance, combined with institutional rigor, can stop extraordinary betrayal. Institutions failed at times here. They trusted the wrong people and the wrong signals. But institutions also corrected when people like Patricia and Agent Rodriguez did their jobs with decency and patience. That balance is the rub of civic life. You need both the civic machinery of law and the human muscle of courage. We did not set out to be a story. We set out to be a family that would not be undone without consequence. In the end, the consequence was not just punishment. It was a ripple of protection, a new program at Pinnacle to train staff, a community center course on financial literacy, a small nonprofit that offers support to victims. Sometimes the best revenge is an elegant program that changes systems. As for the title, the absurd headline that will likely be attached to any telling, yes, my son-in-law was caught in the bathtub with another woman. It is a detail that makes a good opening line because it is vivid and domestic and humiliating. But the bathtub was merely the hinge. The real story is about the way ordinary observation, patience, and lawful collaboration can turn a private betrayal into a public correction. If you find yourself with that little knot in your stomach, the one that says something is off, trust that impulse enough to ask questions and to preserve evidence. Do it legally. Do it with counsel. Do it by handing the facts to people whose job it is to wield law. My bold plan unfolded not because I wanted to be dramatic, but because I wanted to be precise. I wanted our ledger to read clean. Madison and I have learned to wear our scars like badges that remind us to teach others. Being underestimated gave us the leverage to insist on truth. At 62, I have learned that age can come with a kind of quiet power. The power to observe, to speak calmly, and to move the world by returning facts to the place they belong. If this story hits a nerve, if you've ever suspected financial wrong or felt the sting of betrayal, please share it. Tell someone, check your statements, ask questions. We turned pain into purpose. Maybe you can turn suspicion into safety. If you want more stories about how ordinary people work with institutions to stop fraud, or if you need resources on protecting your finances, subscribe and share this video. We're not a spectacle. We're a small community trying to make sure the next story is about prevention rather than predation. And lastly, if you ever find yourself on a porch with a manila folder and a kettle brewing, remember this. Being underestimated is not a weakness. It can be the world's underappreciated tool for justice.